Great day so far today. We had a really spirited morning. Great discussion with some of our former colleagues this morning. I'm going to kick off this afternoon with some of the people who made BSR happen, and it's great to welcome them back. Let me first start welcoming Joel McCower to the stage. Joel, if you've been, yep. You don't know how much of our conference budget went to getting that welcome for you.
No, I appreciate every penny. That was...
Yeah. Joel's a great friend and partner to BSR. Joel's been at every BSR conference. We believe that he's the only person with that distinction. And I know you're going to want to hear about a 30-minute rundown of each one, year by year. Settle in. It'll all be great. Joel, though, seriously, so personal story for me, when I was looking into joining BSR, Bobb Dunn started talking with me and considering my coming. I was in Seattle with my wife, was in the Elliott Bay Book Company, great bookstore.
Pioneer Square, know it well.
Pioneer Square, yes. Thank you,
Seattle.
Thank you very much. Go Seattle. And I stumbled upon a book called Beyond the Bottom Line, which was by Joel McCower and Business for Social Responsibility. And I said, oh, that's really interesting, and read through it, and I will always remember that. So Joel, thank you for that. My first, really only question for you actually is, tell us a little bit about that very first BSR conference in 1993. What was it like?
Yeah, it's really an amazing thing. First of all, it has been such a pleasure to be on this journey with you for almost 25 years, not quite, but thank you for all that you have done and the great team and that you put together. It's amazing. You have to come back to 1993. First of all, we had just come through 12 years of Republican leadership in the United States, and we had a new president. But even before that, we had a group of companies that had come together that spring of '93, and Ben Cohen from Ben & Jerry's, Gary Hirschberg from Stonyfield Farm, Anita Roddick, The Body Shop, and came together and announced this new group called Business for Social Responsibility, and that this was going to be an advocacy group sort of countering the U.S. Chamber of Commerce voice, and it was sort of an interesting moment. A few months later, September 1993, in the Madison Hotel in Washington, D.C., BSR had its first conference, and its keynote speaker was a newly minted president named Bill Clinton. Now, I mean, that's an amazing thing that this young organization had this president, Bill Clinton. But what was even more amazing was that he got up and said something remarkable, particularly at the time. He said, "You are living the rhetoric of my campaign, putting people first." And I have to say, it was one of those, now it sounds like, well, yeah, of course. But at the time, in 1993, it was one of those spine-tingling, just goosebumpy kinds of moments, because somebody got it. Somebody in leadership understood it. Someone was speaking our language, channeling our vision. And that really, I think, created the energy that led to what Bobb Dunn took and that you subsequently took to create this amazing organization. The conversation, in some ways, it's kind of funny. It's changed in some ways it hasn't. We're still, back then, we were talking about doing well by doing good. And, and it's, for some people now, that's sort of a fingernails on a blackboard, but it's still a conversation that people talk about, we hear all too much. And it was a lot more philanthropic and a lot more reputational and a lot more externally facing than where we've come. So there's been this amazing journey. And what I think you organizationally and you as the leader have brought to the table is helping us understand the systemic nature of this as a business and a value chain and a business community and a global community, made it global, which it wasn't originally, connected the kinds of dots and understood that this is ultimately about risk and opportunity. Reputational, financial, right to operate, supply chain, business continuity, and that the opportunity that comes with that. And that's been just this, watching that 25-year path of making this global, making this systemic, making this about opportunity beyond just selling more stuff, is just been a journey that has informed the work that we do at Green Biz Group tremendously, and you've been a great partner, and I just Thank you for all of that, and it's been such a pleasure. I'm looking forward to 26.
Excellent. Well,
2026. Yeah.
Joel, we have up on the stage this afternoon a small number of people who, as I said about Al Gore last night, have changed the way we think about the world, has changed the way business thinks about its place in the world. And I think we run so fast every day. Time goes so fast. It's really important to stop and think about what we have created. Yeah, we've got a lot more to do, but things were not, it was not automatic that things would play out the way they have. And you've been one of those change makers who really has had a massive impact. So thank you so much, and we've got more to do. So
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, yeah, this afternoon's actually a little bit, or more than a little bit, personal for me, because in addition to Joel, we've got two people who have been so central to this movement, so central to BSR's development, and central to me personally, Bobb Dunn and Mats Lederhausen. And a lot of you know Bobb and Mats, probably a lot of you don't. So let me tell you a little bit about them. Bobb had the vision to understand that business had the potential to create social equity, good outcomes, and just basic fairness for people at a time when the global economy was just taking shape. I think he also knew that a wake-up call was needed, and that the kinds of traditional decisions that businesses made weren't necessarily going in the right direction. Just one of Bobb's signal contributions, and I don't know how many of you know this, is he was the architect of Levi's Terms of Engagement, which by most accounts was the first code of conduct for global labor practices. And think about that. I think in 1991, when this was established, the supply chains were exploding, and no one took the step to say, we've got responsibility for the people making our products. We're going to do something about it. Bobb had that clarity of vision, and it is not an overstatement at all to say that there are millions and millions of people around the world, many of them women, in some of the poorest parts of the world, whose lives are better because of what Bobb did. That is, and there are many other things, and Bobb had the vision. I have to say, there are many times when we go about our work at BSR where I think to myself, our car is going in the right direction because of decisions that Bobb made early on that are still very much a living, breathing part of what we do at BSR. Mats Lederhausen. Mats, where's Mats? Mats is over there. Mats always thinks about things differently, so I'm not surprised that he's here somewhere else. Mats is a living, breathing embodiment of the concept of purpose-driven business, and he has pushed in that direction long before anybody started talking about that, long before that phrase was really used. Early in his native Sweden, his father had the franchise for McDonald's in Sweden, and they started thinking about all sorts of things, environment, health, that were not a part of the landscape. And Mats has embodied this for his entire career. Mats invests in purpose-driven businesses because he is a strong believer that the creative power of business, when channeled in the right way, when businesses behave ethically, have such positive impact on the world. Mats is passionate in particular about the food that we eat and health, and this is something that the world is still struggling with, but there are many places where Mats's fingerprints are on healthier diet, more purpose-driven business, and a strong sense of right and wrong. And Mats, there's one thing that Mats said to me, you'd always say to me about BSR, don't be the defensive coordinator for business, don't just manage the risk, be the offensive coordinator for business. So leave it to a Swede to use an American football analogy, but it's spot on. He's now also an American. Spot on comment that it is the creativity of business that has massive potential to build the kind of world they want, that we all want and need. Just a little bit personally, I've never had the courage to ask Bob what kind of risk he thought he was taking when he hired me, because I mean, let's be honest, I didn't really have the qualifications that were needed for the job. Now, it was early in this field's development, so the bar was a little lower. So someday I might be ready to ask you, you know, what were you thinking? Yeah, yeah. Or as someone once said last fall, what the hell do you have to lose, you know? So thank you for having the trust in me, the faith in me. I still hope it'll work out okay, but thank you for the opportunity. Mats was the chair of BSR for 10 years and stepped in when I was named CEO. And Mats was a perfect chair. And Mats was a perfect chair because he knew when to support me and when to challenge me, when to be a friend, and when a friend sometimes needs to say, no, you need to be more decisive, you need to push harder, et cetera, et cetera. And I have learned an immense amount over those years by having Mats as my partner, and my hope is that, well, I hope it's worked out not only for me, but for all of BSR and the community that we are here to serve, and that Mats's fingerprints, like Bobb's, are very, very strongly on this. I can honestly say that this movement would not be as strong, impactful, and as joyful without these two people. So for those of you who know Bobb and Mats, you know that. For those of you who did not know them until today, you now know that. You should thank them. You should support them. We're here to celebrate them. We're here to hear their thoughts about where this whole world should go. So before we get going, my deepest, most heartfelt thanks to these two great leaders and friends. Okay, I am now going to invite not only Bobb and Mats, but one of our newer board members, Kate Brandt, who's the sustainability lead for Google. Kate was the first chief sustainability officer for the United States of America. And yep, there's a job that's open in Washington right now, I think. But Kate is doing great things at Google, has been a great partner, a great board member, and Kate's going to lead us on through this discussion.
Thank you so much. Are you in the middle?
Sure. All right. Good afternoon. Erin, thank you so much for the honor of leading the discussion with these two incredible leaders. It's wonderful to have had the chance to meet you both in preparing for this panel, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So, Bobb, I'd love to start with you. Could you just paint a picture for us? 25 years ago, what was your inspiration for starting this organization, and where were we in the world of business and the world of sustainability at that time?
So, thanks for the kindness in inflating my role. You join Erin in that regard. But it's a challenge to make it a short story, so here goes my best effort. Ralph Nader actually addressed a group of social entrepreneurs and said that every time there was a discussion about public policy in Washington, business came down like a sledgehammer, opposing everything progressive that was being considered. And Nader said that he knew there were people out in the business community who held different views, and there was a need to create some kind of coordinating mechanism so that they could converge and exert an influence. And a group of these entrepreneurs, some of them were named by Joel, put some cash on the table and decided that they would try to create an alternate chamber of commerce. Unfortunately, as is the case with many good ideas and startups, they were severely undercapitalized and didn't fully consider what would be required. And after they had done this for a year or so, it was pretty apparent that the effort couldn't be sustained. Some people referred derisively to the group as a collection of candle makers and sandal makers. And they struggled because they had hoped to create a bridge to larger companies, and they had not been successful in doing so. I knew a number of these people. At the time, I was at Levi Strauss and Company. It was wonderful to see Michael Kaburi here last night and again this afternoon, a stalwart. And they came and asked if I would meet with the board and help them figure out the future. And one option on the table was to disband the organization. And I told them I thought there was a real need for a resource in the field, but not necessarily what they had in mind. And that I was inside a company with extraordinary leadership that was implementing amazing policies and practices. And every time we wanted to tackle a challenge or an opportunity, there was no place to go for help. And I said, you know, if you could focus your attention on the struggles and needs of these companies, then I think you'd have a winning formula. And the board embraced that approach. I became a co-chair with Arnold Hyatt, who's another one of these towering figures in this movement. And we set out to recruit a leader. And we weren't satisfied with the people we were seeing. And Arnold came to me and said, you know, some members of the board think you should do this. This was kind of your idea. You should own it and take responsibility. And I said, not gonna happen. And he said, well, look, you're a co-chair of the board. It's a young organization. We're asking people to make a commitment, take a risk. Write me a letter and write down all the things that get in the way of you saying yes. And I'll just share it with the board and we'll move on. And I wrote him this letter. I'd want to stay in San Francisco. I'd want to know that a year's worth of funding was in the treasury. I'd want to be sure that all companies were welcome if they had a genuine interest in doing better, and mailed it off. And 2 days later, he called and said, I have such wonderful news for you. The board had a meeting and they've agreed to all these conditions. When can you start?
Wow.
And that's how it happened. Yeah.
That is a great story. Yes. So Mats, I know we were talking a little bit before we came on stage about how you initially got involved with BSR and some of the very smart tactics that Bobb used to engage you. So can you tell us a little bit about when you got involved and why and how it came about?
Yeah, he used the same tactics later on me. I'll tell that story. I got involved, I mean, I subscribe to a theory of change that is maybe different than some other people, but I think that people generally are more likely to act themselves into a new way of thinking rather than to think themselves into a new way of acting. And that certainly happened for me. When I was a very young man, I got to run my family business in Sweden, McDonald's. And Sweden is a very progressive place, and I found out the customers kind of didn't like what we were doing. So I said, why? And then I started understanding all these things about sustainability, and we changed a lot of things. And it worked. And then I started asking myself, why aren't more companies doing this? And I became a very concerned and confused capitalist, which I would say has not changed. I think I'm still a concerned and confused capitalist. But in the mid-90s, this was like pre-Google, pre-internet. It was hard in Sweden to find people that shared these views. In fact, it was almost impossible. And I went to speak about these things. I went to Davos. I tried to, and everybody said, this sounds interesting, but I couldn't connect with anybody. And then I found a small group of people that eventually became part of BSR, but they were social venture network people. There was also an organization at Stanford called the World Business Academy. And I heard a rumor that they were coming to Europe to have a meeting of like-minded people. So we met in Basel in the restroom, because it was like 19 people or something. And eventually when I got moved over here to try to change McDonald's in the big picture, Bobb and I connected, And he said, I have a great idea. We're going to have a board meeting. Why don't you host it at McDonald's? And I said, sure. Hosted it, and they hijacked me to join the board. And then later, when they looked for a new chairman, the same went on and on. So you used the same principle, but it's been a great journey. And thank you, Aaron, for those wonderful warm words.
Wonderful.
As I said, when people say these nice things about me, I always say the same thing. My father would have enjoyed them, and my mother would have believed them.
So you've both touched on this a little bit, and Joel gave us some great sneak peek back to having new President Bill Clinton at the first conference. But I'd love to just hear you talk, Bob, a little bit more about where were we in the world of business and sustainability 25 years ago, and what do you think are the most noteworthy changes that we've seen during that time?
Well, as was said by Joel, I guess, in some ways the conversation was quite similar, and in some ways very different. Historically, we had the tumult of the 60s, and that led to all kinds of social enterprises in the 70s. And then we went through a period of time in the 80s, which in some respects is like the current time. There was a sense for business that it was like fishing in a barrel. Anything they wanted was available. And the excesses that emerged from that were considerable. The slogans of the decade were Ivan Boesky saying, greed is good, and Nancy Reagan saying you can never be too thin or too rich. And there was a strong reaction to that in the 80s, and the beginnings of an infrastructure evolved with people like Milton Moskowitz publishing Business and Society and an annual compendium, a report card on business conduct. And it wasn't until the 90s, really, that lots of organizations took root. So the World Business Council, John Elkington writing about the triple bottom line, and so on. The first program that Business for Social Responsibility, BSR, launched was in the climate change space. It was a grant from the EPA, something not likely to happen today. And BSR worked with the kind of dominant players of the time. There was talk earlier in one of the sessions about the Detroit Agreement. We worked with General Motors and Ford and designed a program to influence them to raise the standards of emissions for their supply chain partners. Pretty amazing. And the second program we initiated was really the Business, Human and Labor Rights Program. Aaron, I thought, was quite a good catch, just to respond to his earlier comment. He was an energetic and intelligent lawyer with a wonderful set of values and a determination to be engaged professionally, living out the values that were important to him. And we brought him on board. So what I would say is issues of corporate ethics and governance and human rights and the environment were all part of the conversation. What's really astounding to come to this conference and sit in on these sessions is, first of all, who's in the room. As Matt said, he met with 19 people in Basel, and the first BSR conference had a couple of hundred people, but that was with some padding, actually. And around these tables, I think, are a collection of people who are really in a position of influence in some of the most important private sector companies in the world. And also, I think, to BSR's credit, and BSR deserves some of the credit, when we first began, everyone believed in the concept of partnering, but people didn't have a lot of experience doing that. And the companies were skittish. about meeting with NGOs and engaging in dialogue for fear that their shortcomings would ultimately be used against them. And the NGO community was nervous that they would be accused by peers of selling out if they participated in conversation. So we had a lot of work to do to start a conversation about corporate responsibility and sustainability, to persuade people that when decisions were being taken, that representatives of these concerns needed to be part of the dialogue. But I think BSR today is so much more visionary and is able to tackle problems in a much more systemic way and to be a convener promoting the kinds of collaborations that really produce impact. We weren't hoping for impact in the early days. We were hoping to provide a little bit of support for a small community of courageous pioneers who stepped inside their hostile corporate cultures to talk about these issues.
Yeah. And Mats, I know you've been working on these issues for a long time and in different ways. You talked about your experience at McDonald's, of course, as the chair of the board here, now as an investor. And to Bobb's point, we have this incredible group of people assembled here that are doing incredible work across many sectors and many different capacities. What advice do you have for us? What would you like us to take away from our time here?
Oh, that's a big topic. I think that being in this role is difficult because I think we all share a lot of scars. There's a lot of battles, but there's battles everywhere. And I think surround yourself with believers, more believers than disbelievers. I think one of the most difficult things when you're trying to lead change is you often are prone to let the things you can't do get in the way of what you actually can do. I think it's a very common human mistake. And you almost have to filter and say, okay, here are some really nasty big challenges that I don't see how I can solve. At least not today, or at least not with this CEO I'm working for, or at least not with this set of current results or whatever. Park them aside and just leave them and be okay with it. And then attack all the things you actually can do. While they might feel smaller and less important, the accumulation of the wins and the victories and the momentum and the confidence and the conviction and the learnings you accumulate when you tick them off gets you the energy and the strength to tackle the bigger ones. And I think that is one big learnings. And make sure that if you have a lot of naysayers in your daily life, a lot of people that keep reminding you how difficult things are, and I think you should look for a different audience. I have two life philosophies. One is you are what you eat eats, and the other one is you are who you're with. If you don't feel happy enough, try to recruit some happy friends. If you don't feel creative enough, try to make sure you spend more time with creative people. It's unbelievable. The social contagion of humanity is unbelievable, which is one of the reasons why BSR's conference is important, because we get together, we all share these beliefs. I always felt the sense of responsibility to, inspire you to go home and do great work, because it is possible, it is doable. And lastly, Kate, on your question to Bobb, I think it's worth saying two reasons why the field is very different today. One is legitimization. I think there's power in the repetition. Repetition, somehow is good. So we've been at this for a long time. So people are, it's not going away. Shit, I got to do something about this. So it has certainly more legitimized and more credential. And most companies take this more seriously. And I think people know it's here to stay. But that's not even the main point. The main point is transparency through technology. We can debate, and I debate with myself sometimes, whether customers reward companies for this kind of work. I still think the jury is out on that. I think increasingly they are, but I think it's not as clear as the cost and the penalty for being a bad company has gone up radically. So if you're not paying attention to any of this, you're not going to be around. And because we live in a Clark Kent economy where everybody has X-ray vision and everybody records everything, and you just can't be bad anymore. And that is possibly the most optimistic thing that's going on in the world right now that will yield a bright future, because shit can't hide.
That's great. Do you want to share?
Yeah,
Yes, please. I'd love
do.
to hear your answer to the advice question, too.
So when Mats was talking, I was reminded of a response the Dalai Lama gave to someone who asked what to do about a problem. And he said, well, if you can do something, do it. And if you can't, do something else. And, you know, when I reflect back, particularly on my years at Levi's, but BSR as well, it turns out that what you're able to do really depends on who you are when you're out in the world doing your work. And so if you really want to be effective, I would encourage you to spend a little time reflecting on who you are and who you want to be, and the extent to which you actually model the kind of values that you wish to see your organization emulate, because you exert an influence on that culture. The second thing I would say is to really learn your business. I plead guilty. You know, when I showed up at Levi's, I was convinced I knew what was right and what was wrong, and I was determined to try to jam through as much stuff as I could. And I sometimes felt that the business really didn't understand what I was advocating. And the truth is that it was at least as much the case that I don't think I made an adequate effort to really understand the business, to know when something was a big ask or a small ask, and how I could find ways to ease the consequences of implementing change that in the long term was clearly desirable. And the last piece of advice I would just offer is to learn the skills of being a bridging leader, because as has been said at a number of the sessions, ultimately good decisions are made when everyone is at the table. But when everyone is at the table, that means bringing people together with different mindsets, different values, different experience, different responsibility, different reward systems. And I think the question is, you have a role to play internally, you have a role to play externally, you have a role to play in translating between the internal and external worlds of your company. And you know, someone shared with me that the amount of information and data is increasing at a rate that's unbelievable. It used to be every 25 years it would double, then 10. Now every year. They're saying that soon, every 12 hours, the data and information in the world will double. And what that means is increasingly people are going to rely on trusted resources to help guide them through this incredible array of data and information. And your integrity is going to mean as much as anything as a reliable resource to help a company be successful in admirable ways.
Very well said. Thank you. So I think I'd like to close with asking you both the same question, but Mats, why don't we start with you? So what would you like to see for BSR over the next 25 years? What would you hope we'd be reflecting on when we're here 25 years on?
God. I think my My father actually asks me a lot about this topic. When are you giving up? When are you retiring? When are you stop talking about this? When are you stop tweeting about this? So I'm a big believer in capitalism as a creative force. I believe the main problem we face in society, the meta-level problem, is that we live in a short-term world with long-term problems. The duration of political power and the duration of investment hold times are far too short for the duration of the problems we need to fix. And I find it to be an intellectual collapse that we are not more transparent about that. So what I'd like to see in 25 years or much sooner, and I think it's actually going to happen sooner, and I'd like BSR to be at the forefront of that, is to see a world where capital allocation to firms are based on a much more longer term horizon. I'll give you one example. There are many. We have decided in the Western world, most Western countries, certainly the US, that the long-term cutoff point for a holding of a stock is 1 year. That is pathetic. Since when was 1 year long-term? Ask the Egyptians. What's that all about? Why can't it be 10 years? What would happen if we rewarded people that held on to companies longer? Eric Ries just launched a public stock market where he is going to give governance power and preference in the boardroom and in voting stock for people that hold the companies longer. I think that's a brilliant idea. I think, generally speaking, if we think longer, we think better. And I think I want to see BSR leading that, and I want to see the world heading towards that. I think it is, but that's what I'm most excited about and spend most time on.
That's great. How about you, Bob?
Well, first of all, it's easy to agree with Mats. I usually do. There's a very thoughtful writer named Meg Wheatley. I don't know if any of you are familiar with her. And she talks about how institutions are created to meet a need, and they accelerate their service for a time, and then conditions change, and the institutions start to fail. And when that's happening, people have two choices. One is to invest heavily in the institutions that are failing, and the second is to invest in the new institutions and arrangements that are being born. I think our institutions are failing us. I think they served us well for an extended time. They don't anymore. This is true particularly around the world. I think we put a lot of confidence into democratic governance, and we see it being corrupted all around the world. And so I would like to think that the arrangements in 25 years that meet the goals and objectives that all of us share will come into being in part because of the vision and collaborative initiatives and prototyping that BSR helps promote, and that 25 years from now, this assemblage would look very different because it would be a reflection of those currently excluded from the conversation and excluded from being well served by the institutions we have. And I would hope that Aaron would still be at the helm, and that some of the staff I've met this morning who are long-termers would still be around. And that many of you would be here as well, so that Mats and I are not the only people with gray hair in the audience.
And Joel will still be here.
And Joel, yeah, definitely Joel.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much for your insights and for all your leadership. So thank you again.
Thank you, Kate. I'm going to give you a hug.